Hello and welcome to the Marina Skua Podcast. It is July, which means that here in the UK, summer is in full swing. We've got some gorgeous bright sunny days and yarn is drying ridiculously quickly out on the deck. The flowers in the garden are exploding with colour, which is amazing. Every day I'm going out multiple times a day to pick calendula and coreopsis flowers, which I dry and then use for dyeing. And I've got a really good stash saved up, so I'm excited to start dyeing with those once I've got lots for a nice big batch. The warm weather means warm weather knitting, which I do a little bit of every year, which often means using plant fibres or lighter weight yarns or both, as is currently the case. So since the last episode I have one finished object, well kind of two. We've got my socks, which I have knit from Hey Mama Wolf yarn. You can see the previous podcast episodes. I think I've talked about these in the last couple if you want more details on these, but I just wanted to show you how they look now that they're finished. I'm really pleased with them. They've got these nice little sort of diamondy, zigzaggy details down the side, which sort of remind me of like the teeth of a saw. And so I'm calling them the Teth socks because Teth is Old English for teeth. We just somehow acquired an extra E at some point there. So these ones, I'm going to be writing up the pattern soon, and they're going to be released towards August once they've been tested and tech edited and everything. So yes, I'm very pleased with those, and they're perfect for when it gets a little bit chillier in the evening. At the moment I'm mostly wearing I go around barefooted all day, unless I'm going out somewhere. But in the evening when it gets a bit more chilly, these ones are perfect because they're not really warm and cloying. They've got the little eyelets which add a nice bit of breathability, and so they're lovely, and the yarn seems to be holding up really nicely, which I'm pleased about. And so yes, I've now moved on to my next pair of socks, which I talked about last time that I was going to start. Now I have actually started. These are my Meltemi socks. I don't know how you say that. And you know, I'm sort of about halfway down the feet here. The yarn is this gorgeous salmony colour from Whistle Bear. It's Cuthbert sock, and I'm not sure if you can see there, but it has the most amazing halo on it. It's really something quite special, and I'm very excited about these. So the pattern is from Breeze by Making Stories, and you can see there they've got these rows of eyelets down the front and then coming off on the leg. The pattern's by Verena Koers, who is an excellent designer, and I'm a fan of a lot of her work. And yes, so those I'm doing as part of the Making Stories Summer Sock Knit Along, which is sort of the first proper knit along I'm actually taking part in and properly participating in, which is nice. Seeing all the different socks from different Making Stories publications. Obviously not necessarily obviously, I tech edit for Making Stories, and so from a certain point when I started tech editing for them, I'm quite familiar with a lot of the patterns from a sort of written technical standpoint, but I then don't see the finished objects until long afterwards, and so it's really nice to see lots of people knitting those up, and just sort of how they're turning out. It's a lovely thing to see. And the next thing I've got on the needles is something that I almost resisted when I first saw it, just because it seemed like such an obvious choice for me. It's from Pom-Pom Issue 28, which is this year's spring issue, which I fell in love with the second I started seeing anything from the photo shoots. just because it's got a gorgeous colour palette, and some of the designs are absolutely lovely, and well, as you might be able to tell, I love some plants, and there's a lot of botanically inspired design in here. So I'm knitting the Ginkgo Fight by Emily Green. I love pretty much everything Emily has ever done. There's just something about her use of structural lines and diagonals that really speaks to me. And so yes, I'm not very far in because I only started about 10 days ago. And this is my progress so far on the back. And I have worked out that I'm averaging about just over a centimetre of length a night, which means that I will probably finish it in about 3.5 months' time, which is a slightly depressing prospect considering it's a summer top. But hey-ho. As is the case with pretty much every pom-pom project I've ever knit, I'm not knitting to the correct gauge. In this case, I'm using a much finer yarn than is called for in the pattern. This is Oshika 200, which is a Rami yarn, which is, well, it's a plant fibre, it's nettle fibre, and it's a bast fibre like flax, and so I was sort of expecting Rami to have that similar sort of springy, stiff quality, like not unpleasantly stiff, but it's definite, like flax is often quite stiff. Whereas this is very unlike that. It's really very soft, and if I were to describe it in one adjective, it would be floppy. It's got an enormous amount of drape to it, which I'm actually really keen on. And so the gauge I'm getting doesn't match the pattern. I've got a lot more stitches per centimetre, and I often make adjustments like this just by knitting a different size in the pattern. This is easier when I'm usually on the smaller side of patterns, so when I'm using a finer yarn I can usually just cast on the number of stitches for a larger size to get the correct eventual size for me. If I'm knitting with a chunkier yarn, often I'll have to grade another size myself as it's smaller than the pattern goes. So basically it's just working out the ratio between the gauge I'm getting for the fabric I want using the yarn I want and the gauge specified in the pattern. Working them out as a ratio, and then working out the ratio between the bust measurements of the size I want and then the size I will need to knit. Obviously I still, like, that only affects the width. I will follow instructions for where it specifies centimetres rather than number of rows. For lengths, I will follow the length in centimetres for my correct size rather than for the new size that I'm knitting. I hope that all makes sense. It sounds very convoluted, but it's some quite basic maths, and I do encourage people to do that kind of thing because I think playing around with yarns to create the fabric you want and to sort of work with what you've got to make a pattern you want to, rather than having to buy new yarn for it, I think is really nice, because I can't find any patterns that I really want to knit that are suitable for the gauge of this yarn. I mean, it's a very fine fingering, and I really wanted to make this pattern. I didn't have yarn that was more suitable for it, and so with just some fairly quick adjustments, I know that I just need to follow size, I think I'm following size 3 where I would usually follow size 1, because the pattern also has a lot of positive ease built in, so if the sizing isn't quite correct, there's still a decent margin for, you know, there's wiggle room, and so hopefully it will end. I mean, it's I'd say that's about the sort of size I want. And so yeah, I do plan to write a blog post on this eventually. I've been saying that for probably over 6 months. But in the meantime, I will post a link to a blog post by Claire Mountain, who's Sister Mountain. She does some gorgeous designs and also has some very useful blog posts on sort of additional knitting skills, slightly more based on the maths, and she has one on how to adjust knitting patterns based on your size requirements, and I think that's really helpful, so I'll post a link to that below. So yeah, in terms of knitting projects, that's sort of what I've got going on. I have a couple of things I'm going to be starting at some point soon. One of them I can't tell you about, and one of them I'm just not going to tell you about because I've been planning it for probably about 2 years now and it hasn't happened yet. So I will tell you about that when I actually get started, because who knows how long it's going to be. Many of you are probably aware of a yarn story, which is one of my local yarn shops here in Bath. I still remember the first time I went into the shop years ago now, and it was so interesting to see all of the amazing fibres, the indie yarn brands, the beautiful hand-dyed colours, and I was so inspired by what Carmen, the owner, had put together and what she still, years later, is turning into something that's more and more amazing. And because of that, I'm so excited that as of this Saturday, I'm going to be doing a pop-up in a yarn story with some of my hand-dyed yarns, and it's really a bit of an honour to be included in just a shop that is such a beautiful space, and to be accepted by someone who I have known for years, and who's been a huge inspiration to me as a business person. So I'm going to be in the shop on Saturday from 11 until 3, where, you know, if you come along then you can come and have a chat and squish the yarn, and I can tell you a bit more about its background if that's what interests you. And then the yarns will be in the shop until the 4th of August, stock depending. And so I thought I'd just show you a couple of the things I'm going to be having in there. There will be a decent amount of Mendip DK. I've been busy dyeing away on that. Quite a lot of Mendip 4-ply, both the sunny and stormy colours, and some Kaya Baby Alpaca. And then there will be some hand-dyed yarn. So the first one I'm going to show you is, sorry, by hand-dyed I mean naturally dyed. It's all hand-dyed. I mean naturally dyed. The first colour is this one, which, if you saw the last episode, might be familiar to you. This is the Eucalyptus Dye that I did in the previous episode. So it's this lovely golden, sort of yellowy, mustardy colour, and I'm really pleased with how that's turned out. It's very, very warm and sort of soothing. And then there's this one, which is also eucalyptus, but I've used iron as a modifier, and it's got a little bit of variegation going on. I don't know if you can see, but there are some bits that are just a little bit darker, and this is one of those colours that's really difficult to describe. I think the closest you can get to it is sort of taupe. It's a kind of beigey grey, but with tiny yellowy greeny hints, but sometimes it looks a bit brown. It's it's lovely and sort of, yeah, I'm really pleased with how that's come out. And then in the exhaust bath, I did this one, which is again eucalyptus and iron, but at this stage it's getting very, very pale because there's not as much dye stuff in the water. And so this is just the most beautiful pearly pale grey, which I'm very, very pleased with. So those three colours are all from the same vat, as it were, and have just been shifted accordingly. And so there will be batches of those available. And then there's also this colour, which you won't have seen, which is coming out a bit beige, I think, on the camera here, but it's actually a very pale, sort of soft grey green, which is one of my favourite summer colours. This one is from various plants in my garden, lots of dandelion and also some herb robert, which is geranium, and again it's got some iron in it to cool the colour down a bit and shift it towards the green from the yellow. So I'm really pleased with this one. And so these colours, I just think that's a nice little range. And so these will be alongside some colours that have been previously available, and they're in batches of 4 to 7 skeins, so there aren't huge quantities of them available. So if you are going to be going along to the pop-up shop, do if you're after naturally dyed ones, do snap them up quick, because they, you know, once these ones have sold out, I won't be doing exactly the same colour again because of the nature of the way I work with natural dyes. I work with what I have available. I don't buy in dye stuff. I work with what I've got locally, and that's why the batch sizes tend to be slightly different, and it's a way for me to sort of play and experiment and incorporate a little bit of spontaneity in what I'm doing. So yes, if you are local or happen to be in the area, do come by. As I said, the pop-up will be open from the 20th of July to August the 4th is the final day. And Carmen will also have some of my skeins available on the A Yarn Story website, so do check that out too. Something I haven't shared on the podcast over the past year is any sewing, even though I consider sewing to be quite a big part of my making. That is mostly because this time last year, almost exactly a year ago, I was working on my wedding dress, and once I finished that, I sort of lost my sewing mojo a little bit, and I'm just now getting back into it. And so I thought I would show you one of my projects. So this is some vintage silk. I have a lot of fabric that I've inherited from my mother, my grandmother, my aunt. I come from a family of sewers, and so I have a lot of fabric stash. This is is not a very soft silk. It's got quite a crisp feel to it. It's reasonably opaque, and I dyed it first using the exhaust batch from the exhaust dye from the eucalyptus that I showed in the last clip, and that turned out a sort of pale beigey yellowy colour. It was a nice colour, it really was, but it was much too close to my skin tone, and as I want to turn this into something I'm going to wear, I decided that I needed to over dye it, and so I over dyed it with onion skins, which has given this gorgeous mustardy sort of golden yellow, which I'm really pleased with. It's actually not a colour I wear particularly frequently, but I think it's going to be really pretty to wear this summer. and I may as well make something that is going to be ready for summer, unlike my ginkified. So I thought I would just show you the process of making a dress, which I will hopefully wear to a wedding at some point this summer. I'm going to be basing it, I can show you how much fabric I have. It's, you know what, I haven't even measured it because that's the kind of sewer I am. I did work at a tailor's. I was only there for about 6 months because it ended up being not at all what I wanted to be doing. However, since then, and needing to be very precise on other people's projects, I am not on my own. I'm very much wing it and see how it goes. So I'm going to be basing it on this dress, which is one I made last summer. This one is a long one. It's made from some amazing fabric that I got at Village Haberdashery in London. It's got quite, I don't know if you can see there, it's got quite a low back to it, a sort of slightly squared off back, which I really like. And a lot of the way I make clothes is to maximise use of fabric and minimise use of zips, because I don't like zips. So this has, it's got a couple of little panels in the back there, so there are seams coming down here and also a centre back seam, so I could use small pieces in there. And then there are a couple of little pleats just in the back here, just to add a bit of extra width in the skirt. But other than that, and the neckline and armhole shaping, there's no side shaping, so it's just straight up and down, and there's no fastening, so I can just slip it over, which is exactly my kind of dress. So I'm going to be using this as a bit of a template. This dress was made from a previous dress I made, using that as a template. I, at some point many years ago, drafted a bodice block, not a proper bodice block, but just a width that suits me. This top is actually probably made from that same block. And everything I've made since then has probably been working from that. It doesn't include darts or princess seams or anything. It's just straight up and down, has the width of shoulder I like, and then I can play around with neckline shapes because I like variation in necklines, even though they're usually some variant on a round sort of scoopy neck. So yeah, I'll show you my very rough process of making it. So I'm going to be cutting the bodice first. I have the fabric folded in a way that means I've got just enough space for the bodice, and then I'll use the rest for the skirt. You can see that I don't have quite a rectangle of fabric here because I have used some of this silk for a previous project, so it's not cut off square there. So I've folded this. Sorry about all the seagulls. I folded the fabric so that this should just fit. I'm going to be basing my bodice shape on the front of this because the back is going to be different. I've got my waist seam here, so I'm leaving just enough space for a bit of seam allowance there. So I've now refolded my fabric so that I've got the biggest rectangle possible for the skirt. So I'm going to be having some pleats in the skirt, just for a bit of extra fullness, and they're going to be sort of placed at the hip, and it's going to be nice and straightforward and simple. I'm just pinning these here so the layers don't shift over each other. So this fabric actually has a very nice, neat selvage, which is the natural edge of the fabric, which is this one over here. So I'm actually going to use that as the hem of the fabric. It's not usually recommended because the selvage can stretch at different rates. Sometimes, like often it's not in the same weave if you've got an interesting weave in the fabric, or it's woven more densely. But in this case, the selvage is basically a continuation of the fabric, and it's just a nice neat edge. So I'm just going to use that as the hem. And so this that I'm trimming now will be the waist and will be stitched onto the bodice. The skirt's just going to be one big panel with the pleats added in, and then it'll have a seam down the centre back. I'm outside because the table is outside. You've probably noticed from the noise. We've got the table outside for the summer, and although it's quite a calm day, there is a little bit of a breeze going on. And I'm just eyeballing this, following the grain of the fabric, which again is not really a thing I should be doing, but that looks pretty square to me, so that will all be fine. So I have that there. That will be sewn onto my bodice, and I'm going to do pleats sort of like this, and I'll do that once I've sewn the side seams of the bodice, and then I'll just finish off the arm and neckline, and that'll be it done. It's going to be a nice quick one. pleased how this has turned out. I think it's a nice dress, especially for summer. It looks like I'm going to be able to get away with not having to wear a slip underneath, which is nice. So yes, I'm looking forward to wearing it out and not just sitting in the house. And that is all I have time for this month. So I really hope you've enjoyed the podcast. If you've come back after watching previous episodes, I'm so pleased, and I hope that the large amount of sewing hasn't put you off. I might be doing a bit more sewing on the podcast in the future. Let me know if that's something you're interested in, or if you're more keen on the knitting and the dyeing and all of that. So in the meantime, if you want to keep up with me between podcast episodes, best way to do so is via my newsletter, which goes out once a month, but then also there are additional updates when I launch new products and things. You can find a link to that on my website. I'll put a link below. And you can catch me on Instagram, where I have a few more behind the scenes type things. And so if you have enjoyed the podcast and do want to contribute to help me keep it going, you can donate on Ko-fi. Very much appreciated whenever people do that. And so until next month, bye bye.